Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to A Gathering Place. And today we have a fascinating show. We're welcoming our special guest, Dr. Hank Singleton, and we're going to talk about Black women and the Black church today. This is a continuation of our conversation regarding African American theology and the social justice traditions. And this is just a continuation of that conversation. So thank you for joining us today. Get ready to drop your questions and comments in the comment section because this is going to be a hot conversation right after this opening.
Hello, I'm Marilyn Hemingway, and welcome to A Gathering Place. I said, I'm stepping back because we have young voices who want to be heard and they're moving on something.
Branding is really important to you and your business.
Even a basic type of technology, you learn it all.
And people are
Good question. Well, we're back, folks, and today's A Gathering Place is about Black women and the Black church. Drop your questions and comments in the comment section. We're ready to hear from you. And let's go ahead and bring on our special guest. We are always delighted to have him with us, Dr. Harry Singleton. Dr. Singleton, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back again. To share with your audience and to continue our conversation on African American theology as we move from the category of race broadly conceived to the unique experience of Black women's oppression.
That's right. That's right. And before we get into it, I just want to make sure everybody understands he's done the research and I have my opinion and we all have our opinions. But what I want to get started when we created A Gathering Place was conversations. Mm-hmm. I think we really need to have these conversations in the Black community on an intellectual level, but also very much on a grassroots level because it informs our decisions. It informs the choices we make that impact our community. So it's always good to have someone like a Dr. Singleton join us who's done the research, who has a voice that we all need to hear. Let's go ahead and get started because this is, I think, a hot topic. We were kind of talking around it during our previous conversations, and I think there were a couple questions that folks had. But let's start at the nitty gritty. How would you characterize the treatment of women in the church and Black women in the Black church, in particular, in light of what's happening in evangelical churches, what's happening in society right now? Your thoughts. Let's start there.
Yeah, we concluded the show the last time I was on it with a discussion that spilled into the unique experience of Black women's oppression, which is a highly unregarded topic in the Black community because since slavery and emancipation, Black men got the opportunity then to frame the struggle for Black people, which emerged for them exclusively within the context of race. In their short-sightedness, they did not have the ability or the vision to recognize that the racial struggle for justice was only one struggle, that Black women were also involved in another struggle. And that was a struggle where their own womanhood had to be reinterpreted out of the Christian trappings and the white societal trappings relative to their morality, relative to their aesthetic appeal, relative to their intelligence. And so we ended last show with that. And you suggested that we continue this conversation, particularly when I ended it by saying that I don't know if there's any other institution that's done more of a hatchet job on the image of women than religious institutions. On the surface, it sounds pretty blasphemous to make such a statement, but in reality, it is not. When we examine biblical revelation itself, only 2 of the 66 books are written by women. And of course, that's Ruth and Esther, and both of those are in the Old, or what we now call the First Testament. there are no books that were selected for the New Testament canon that were written or penned by women. And so you see the male bias inherent even in the compilation of the scrolls that would become the books of the Bible. But when we look more closely at biblical revelation too, we see that women have always been portrayed mainly as the victims of men's moral failures. And so we begin with a highly patriarchal take on the first two creation stories. In Genesis 1, we see God creating both creating both males and females. In the second Genesis story, we see a man doing the primary work of creation, is tired from his labors, and God takes a rib from the man and creates a woman. And so patriarchy has, of course, chosen that particular creation story because it maintains then that women came from men, that they should be subject to men, and that men should be subject to God and God alone. So that was not, in other words, a relationship of equality, but relationship of gender subordination. Even when we look at the New Testament, we look at Paul's writings, particularly in Romans, we see church leaders identifying his characterization of Phoebe as a co-worker and not as an official apostle. And more particularly the 1 Corinthians 14 passage of the so-called silence of women in the church, particularly as it relates to the deliberations of the life of the church. And then, of course, referring to that same hierarchical language again, relative to women asking their husbands about matters divine, while men themselves, of course, got their information in direct revelation from God. And so you see, even in biblical revelation, this process of subordinating women to men, and Christian history followed. The Council of Nicaea in 325, one of our major councils, mandated that deaconesses not be considered ordained, which was kind of a red herring issue because we're really not talking about deaconesses. We were talking about the upper echelons of leadership in the church. And of course, all of the early church fathers followed suit. Augustine, Irenaeus, Tertullian, all opposed women's ordination. And of course, we see Pope Gelasius I, particularly in 494 in the Catholic Church, writing a letter calling the ordination of women anathema. Even without progressive movements in the life, we see the Protestant Reformation, the break from Catholicism, the Lutheran Church, Martin Luther, the great reformer. He was concerned about indulgences in the church. And he was, of course, concerned about having the Bible translated into native languages of a growing Christian community. The Catholic Church in the 3rd century had maintained that Latin was the only language and the official language in the church. And so he was more concerned about those two issues, less about women's ordination and their place in the church. It was almost by that time in the 15th century a fait accompli in the life of the church. Of course, even with the Catholic progressive movement of Vatican II, this council, one of the most significant councils in the history of the church in the late 60s, where we see the language coming out of preferential, asking for a prayer of forgiveness for not addressing the issues of the poor and structural injustice, as well as it should have as an integral part of the church. But again, the fait accompli of a woman's ordination was pretty much set in stone. And even with our current Pope, considered probably the most progressive Pope, as the Catholic Church now has a shortage of pastors. And they have two things you have to do to become a Catholic priest, and that is to learn Latin, because it's still the official language of the church 1700 years later, from when it was established in the 3rd century. And of course, you have to take a vow of celibacy. And so the church has reasoned, that the hierarchy of the church has reasoned that the reason why this shortage exists of Catholic priests is because men are afraid of the celibacy clause, or do not want to go through the celibacy process. They want to continue to have families just like priests in any other major denomination. And so Pope Francis is giving serious consideration to laxing the standard of celibacy. But when asked, would he want to fill some of those vacancies in the Catholic Church, the local parishes, with women, and would he consider extending ordination to women, his quick answer was no, and maintained that it was an eternal dictum. And so what is the bottom line? The bottom line, very simply, is this: that we have a history where the church itself has been involved in exclusionary measures because of a distinguishing physical characteristic, in this case, gender. And so I wanted to make sure I laid the foundation for that before we move to the specifics of the Black church, because it is important to keep in mind that the Black church emerged not only out of that Christian history of exclusion, but it also emerged in plantation life in the period of slavery. And so not only do you have exclusionary measures taking place for women on the basis of gender, but also men of color too on the basis of race. And so when we examine then, as a result of this exclusionary measure, the Black church really, in its leadership, its male leadership, really internalized and inherited those patriarchal traditions from the white church, both in history and on the plantation. And so while Black men were zeroed in and spied in on the racial struggle for justice, they did not have the presence of mind to see that Black women were involved in a unique form of oppression, particularly sexual oppression, about their womanhood and about their image, particularly as it related to tempting slave masters, which was the narrative emerging out of slavery, and their looseness sexually, their promiscuity sexually, that they were the evil temptresses of the Bible that we think about when we think about Jezebel. And so this is a battle that Black women, unfortunately, have had to wage for the most part by themselves, namely because they have not been able to convince their Black male partners, both in the ministry and their Black male partners who are their spouses and companions, of this unique experience of their oppression.
Let me ask you this, and thank you for giving us that foundation, because I think that's so important, because so many times we form our opinions based on recent thought, recent history, rather than understanding foundations. And foundations are so important because whether we want to admit it or not, we take bits and pieces of that foundation with us, even through generations. And we make those decisions based on that, and we don't understand where things really came from, why we think this way, what influenced our grandparents, our great grandparents, that ultimately is passed down through the generations. And let's go back to that foundation just a little bit. How much thought is put into, and if I'm wrong, because I'm a lay person, I am not a theologian, but first, the King James Bible influences so much of this, and you talk about the Latin, but Latin was not the original language of biblical books. So even in the translation, whether it's Latin from the original language to Latin, and I'm not saying the original language because I can't even pronounce it, and I know it, I can see it in my head. Even it speaks to, even because we're human and we're flawed, even when we translate things, we never translate accurately, because any language has dialects. Any language has local colloquialisms that influence that language. Tone of voice influences language. So when you translate something, somewhere there's going to be something that's not accurate. So when we translated it from the original language to Latin or to King James to English, I don't want to say mistakes, but tone deafness, not quite being accurate in what was really intended in the original book. So I picked up on the word that you said, selected. You know, there are 2 books by women, Esther and Ruth, but those selected tells me that there are more books that were from the original. So here, there's exclusion. Anybody selected, and then who selected? European males, let's generalize. European males selected what was going to be in the Bible. So if we have that understanding right then and there, you have to start questioning what was the intention in the translation. And the intention, speaking as a woman and as a Black woman, was to create a patriarchal system. was to control, whether it was based on gender or based on race. And we have to have that understanding. And for me, then it starts, I'm going to question certain things. Why does it have to be this way? Because just because it is, just because it's a tradition, does not mean it has to be this way. So we have these conversations. We have an opportunity to change.
Right.
There's nothing set in stone, but you have to understand the foundational, where to start, and how does it impact now, so we can make some different directions. Because as a Black female, a Black woman in the church, there's some serious damage that needs to be rectified. But we have to have an understanding of where it came from first. So go ahead while I am. There's some comments coming in.
Well, the first part, Marilyn, is the most difficult part. You use the terminology damage. Being in a bourgeois society, a term I used the last time I was on, two problems immediately suggest themselves. Number one, most bourgeois societies are ahistorical because they don't want people knowing their history, knowing the origins of this behavior, and seeking to transform it. Namely because they benefit from that situation. White males benefit, patriarchal benefits white males, and so they don't want you to know about it so that you can unearth solutions that might change it, because they want to continue with that privilege. And so what happens then is that you're absolutely right. We're dealing with a problem of translation. We're dealing with a problem of interpretation, but more particularly, you use the word intent. And when your intent is to create a hierarchical society, the Bible is certainly a book in which you can use to forward a hierarchical understanding of human relationships. And so the intent is to create the hierarchy, and then to make those who are damaged, to use your terminology, and it's very accurate terminology, to make them think that there is no damage, to make them think that this is just a natural ordering of things. And religion's role in creating and perpetuating that so-called non-damage is that it is considered the most sacred institution in the community. And so now you're not only dealing with damage from a socio-political standpoint, but also you're dealing with damage now in questioning the very foundation of the intent of the framers of the theology of the church. And so it puts you in an awkward position of being this perceived militant revolutionary who's coming to destroy what we have taken a history of multiple generations to create. And that's what makes it dangerous all the time. That's what made it dangerous for Jesus. He came to undo a formalistic religion where the emphasis was on personal morality and the emphasis was on otherworldliness and not on socio-political problems. And so as a result of him trying to transform the thinking in the minds of people of faith at his time, the powers that be maintained that he would be better off being dead. And so there is a martyrdom dimension to this at the larger levels of the extent that a bourgeois society that's seeking to hold on to privilege will go to maintain that privilege, even if it means killing those who emerge among that people whom they are isolating and insulating and oppressing, and who is able to articulate the struggle in such a way that that person can have a huge impact on the transformation of that relationship. And so the struggle is how do you get people to see that what they have been doing for 1,800 years is damage? And that befalls me as a scholar of religion, particularly as a theologian, to construct a different intent with Christian theology, or any theology, but particularly Christian theology in our context, that is not rooted in the damage that is created by establishing race, gender, poverty as being sacred in the life of the church, and that therefore one should not question their existence. Or if you do question their existence, you are really questioning the very foundations of the church itself, that either has condoned this activity or maintained that the church as a sacred institution does not deal with these activities and their transformation. And that becomes doubly damaging, because then you tell people in their damage, you're not really damaged. This is just simply the way the Lord wants it. And this is exactly what we were told on the plantation as African Americans. This is what women have been told. And even today, the narrative is going out, particularly in evangelical outlets, that people are poor simply because they want to be. A narrative, by the way, that was circulating even in the time of Jesus. And God decides to incarnate God's self in Jesus to a poor and a marginalized people to identify in an unqualified way with them, which means that Jesus came to bring a new narrative to try to correct that damage.
And you see, I'm going to add another aspect to that also, is that the person who is damaged, in this case, we're talking about females, in particular Black females, in many ways also upholds the very system that has damaged them. In many ways, and y'all can get mad at me, y'all go ahead and comment, is that we actually uphold the very system that has damaged us. And you will have people fighting you. They will fight you, just because they will fight you because I think they're seeing, if I have to really think about this, if I have to use my free will and start questioning things, it's going to force me to question the system that upholds whatever little bit of martyrdom or power that I have within that system. Not realizing that if you remove the system, you actually gain more power. And the church itself is so contradictory because we keep talking about a personal relationship with God, my personal relationship with Jesus. Well, if I had a personal relationship with Jesus, a real personal relationship with Jesus, with God, then the church itself, the way it's constructed right now, would be removed out of my life. The patriarchal church that I'm talking about, and so it's kind of like dangling the carrot. And when you get ready to grab that carrot, they yank it away. And that carrot is that personal relationship. But if you really have a personal relationship, you're going to start questioning some stuff. So the oppressed actually become part of the system.
Well, if the relationship is authentic. Now, I will make the bold statement that most of our personal relationships have been authentic because they've been rooted in ideology. What I mean by that is that they have been rooted in getting us to accept an understanding of faith in God and Jesus that contradict being totally free as human beings. It is an ideology that has called us to not only sacrifice, but more particularly to assign ourselves to a passive resignation relative to our unjust situation. That in that sense, it's hard to speak about a moral framework that's just in a society that's rooted in racial and gender oppression, and that the most sacred institution in the life of the nation condones that activity and has historically, there's our word, condoned that activity. And so you have to question the nature of any personal relationship with God that's stressed for one to address exclusively in their life of faith, to the exclusion of issues of socio-political oppression on the basis of race, gender, and poverty as well. And so we have to question the authenticity of a personal relationship that causes anyone of faith to have to accept an oppressive relationship in the name of faith and in the name of God.
So let's get a little real with this, Dr. Singleton. Where do you see the church right now regarding Black women and the Black church? Where is it going? And I say this, I'm of the generation that was raised that wait on the Lord. God's going to send you a man. That's my generation. It was, it was, that was my generation. I don't know. And I say that in terms of age, because I don't know what the younger women are hearing. I do see some things, but I don't know what the church is telling them. But when I was coming through, it was like, it really, especially when I was in college, and it was so much about controlling us. And
Absolutely.
I cannot tell you how much, at the time you're not realizing it was about control, because if you're raised in the church, what we're talking about, it was about, it was controlling behavior. But I don't think we ever thought about it in those terms But looking back with age and experience that life teaches you, I look back and say, that was just totally about control of our bodies, control of our behavior. But we also heard the stories about the deacons who weren't, the deacons and the ministers running around their wives. I cannot tell you, because I've worked in the healthcare field and marketing, how many, it's the unspoken room talk of how many ministers have HIV and their wives stand by them. So that's my generation. With me, I'm single, never married. So I think in some way I never bought into that. But I see in the younger generation almost a wholesale rejection of that. Much more independent minded, and quite, in my opinion, good for them. But I ask this of, what is the church really seeing? Because the core people that you see in church are females.
Right.
Do they not realize that those older females they're starting to die off? Those ones that you can always count on every Sunday, and they're not going to buy into that anymore, that control of their behavior. Just so where do you see that the church going with this?
Well, maybe not, in terms of control with the younger generation. The reality is that when we get older, we tend to get more conservative in our theological outlook. And so whereas a young woman would not have brought into it in her 20s, she may begin to buy into it after hearing it now in her 40s and her 50s. So much of what we learn in the church and what we're taught in the church, and in this sense it hadn't changed, revolves around individual wish fulfillment. Your man is coming, your woman is coming, your destiny is coming, your breakthrough is coming. We can designate a whole section in the library on books on human fulfillment and motivational success. 5 steps to success, 12 steps to success. And so what really happens is that there's always a cure for any wish fulfillment prophecy in the larger society, and that is math. Math always challenges any individual wish fulfillment. In this case, a woman being told that her man is coming. Well, one of the reasons why there are so many more women in the church than men is because there's many more Black women in the society than Black men. Because Black men are going to jail in alarming numbers, they're getting killed in alarming numbers, they're on parole systems, or they have given up on life altogether, and you see them on street corners. And so wherever you go, in fact, as I get older, I am noticing when I go places that I didn't notice in my 20s or even cared to give any thought to, how many more Black women are in that room than Black men. And so if math holds true and racial conventionality holds true, as we move into adulthood, there are going to be far more marriageable Black women than Black men, which means that if we can only marry one person, chances are you're talking about moving into your 30s, 40s, and 50s, and that man may not ever come along that you have been promised, not necessarily because God dislikes you or because God's favor is not on you or because you conducted yourself in an immoral manner as a woman and therefore you don't deserve a man, but simply because there's not enough of them to go around. And so one of the things that has always disturbed me, and I can understand the pitch, but I don't necessarily agree with it. We have to be very careful about how we commodify God to our congregations. I have to be careful about how I commodify God, even in my writings and even when I speak. And we have to make sure that we are creating the proper societal reality with the help of God that lends itself to that individual wish fulfillment and not ignore those societal distinctions and maintain that somehow miraculously God is going to change that condition. It didn't get into this condition overnight. It got into this condition over several generations. And for several generations as Black people, we have been fighting. And Black women have been fighting not only in the society, but they have been fighting in the church. some of them have internalized the conventionality, like you said, about not questioning what men do, because from a racial standpoint, we were not supposed to question what white people did. We were not supposed to question their racial morality. There were even drivers on the plantation that whipped us more than womanhood in this context is also making sure that we are affirming personhood within the context of oppressive relationships, and that we are targeting those oppressive relationships because that forms the cornerstone of a new identity and a new intent, to use your term, that not only advances the Black community racially, but also advances the cause of Black women too when it comes to sexism. And so we must not allow ourselves to get caught up in individual wish fulfillment that ignores societal conditions.
I just want to remind everyone that you are with us here at a gathering place, and our guest today is Dr. H Singleton, and we are talking about Black women in the Black church, and we are really getting into this conversation. Let me go back to these numbers right now, because y'all, I'm the lay person, he's a theologian, all right? So I have been saying for years that if you lined up every man, regardless of race, if you lined up every man and every woman, eventually you will have less men than women. And what you just said with the Black race, now let's add the race back into it. If you lined up every Black man and every woman, Black woman, in particular in the United States, you eventually will run out of Black men. And it just doesn't make sense to say to someone, just hold on, God gonna send you someone, because the numbers don't add up. It simply doesn't add up. And I think it's a crime. And I'm just gonna call it, it's a crime that we were raised that way. It's manipulative. It borders on abusive, and abusive in the sense that it has allowed some ministers to take advantage of their congregations, in particular congregations that are majority Black female, that you've given them false hope. And I say my generation, because in particular, I can only speak for my generation, that there are women now, that's all they have. It's the church. Because they were raised that way, and you didn't give them other options. It's a bit of a brainwashing. And I just think how many of us missed opportunities where we could have traveled, we could have had different type of careers, but literally it was drilled that God's going to send you. I just remember that, and just earlier before we started the show, we had a brief conversation that I had to remind myself that you had to remind me that we have a certain privilege. And I was exposed to different things, Air Force brat, and it just gave me a chance to do some traveling as an adult, do things some differently, just see different options. But those who, in particular, maybe from a small town like Georgetown, where I'm from, or Conway, there are many people who that was their life. And at most, maybe they went to college and became a teacher, came back home, and they go to church. And we pat them on the back, or we uphold them as the backbone of the church. But we never really see their humanity. We never really see them beyond that Black female martyrdom of look how much they're doing for the church. But I have to be honest with you, and in times I thought in terms of how that's a harem for some of these ministers. And I'm not saying a harem as in sexual, but harem with this minister is getting everything that he wants. He's got the first lady, his wife, but he's also surrounded by all these other women, Black women, who do everything for him. And he constantly telling them, wait on the man, but y'all don't have, what are y'all doing to put the man in the church to meet these women? The men are outside the church. I think there's a selfishness there. It's I don't know if it's subconscious, but there is a man almost pushing other men away from their harem because it's a control thing. I just wanted to say that. I don't know if you have any.
Well, you're right. You're right. Well, you're right. Black religious leaders and some white religious leaders tend to be very, very territorial. And one of the things that not only the damage that you referred to earlier, Marilyn, but the ultimate damage is justified theologically in the minds of many religious leaders by making women think that their only contribution to society is to be a wife and to be a childbearer. And that is an age-old narrative that completely disintegrates a woman's intelligence and her contribution societally and to civilization beyond being a childbearer. In fact, in Christian history, Mary is referred to as Theotokos, or the bearer of God. That's her contribution, not her intelligence, not her contribution to an ongoing theological discussion that could transform human relationships, but strictly as a childbearer. And as you know, over the years, I've always cringed when I've heard even older women buy into this narrative about Black women in particular not being a woman unless she gets married and has children and has all two before she's 30. And I hear older women saying, when a young Black woman does something, oh, you ain't gonna get no husband doing that. Mm-hmm. Oh, you ain't gonna get no husband doing that. Oh, if you do that, you ain't gonna get no husband. As if that is the exclusive reason why a woman has her existence. But we can't divorce that from men setting up a patriarchal society that make women think that that is their exclusive contribution to civilization. And so they both work hand in hand where that is concerned. I
agree with you that they work hand in hand.
Yeah, they work hand in hand. And part of the ongoing struggle is a theological struggle relative to the way women are imaged in Christian history. And of course, we are back to the subject of history again, and how history continues to perpetuate and impose its influence on the present, which is why it is foolhardy for us to be so-called enlightened in the 21st century and talk about depriving students of their history, depriving Black students of their history, how we overcame the struggles of the abolitionist community and the slave community, the attempts now in contemporary society to remove African-American authors and writers who affirm the struggle for human emancipation, women who affirm the struggle for Black women's place in society and the unique experience of Black women's oppression from the plantation to the day. And then you got a conservative element in this society wanting to remove those because they are considered controversial. The reason they're considered controversial is not because they are. The reason they're considered controversial is because they have been designated as being controversial to attach a stigma to them so that it will not be well connected in the literary world of an America that continually tries to diminish the significance of history, but at the same time experience a contemporary history wherein they have privileged from that history. And that is the juggernaut to the contradiction, the moral contradiction that continually has to be exposed in contemporary conversations about race and gender.
Oh, you have this knowledge, it becomes the threat to the patriarchal system.
Yes.
They're operating from a place of fear, but that place of fear is dangerous to the oppressed and not even dangerous to the oppressed, but there's always ripple effects to others that may not be directly impacted. So we're talking about Black women in the Black church and this patriarchal history that has been inherited and very much still in use. The direct person who's impacted this may be the Black female. She's controlled, voice oppressed, but the ripple effects it's the children that we produce, our children, the next generations, and our men also.
Yes,
our men are also hurt by this.
Absolutely. And let's be clear, this is not something that we're talking about in ancient history from the 4th century. We're talking about that only from a historical standpoint. Many Protestant ministers, Black and white, will not ordain a woman to the priesthood in 2022. Not 1922 or 1822 or 1722. The Catholic Church, even with a so-called progressive pope, his quick answer to the ordination of women is no. And in most instances, if not all of them, as we have established, women do the bulk of the work in the church, but they're doing it as a subordinate. So what kind of message does that send to young women coming up in the church? And what kind of message, as you said, does that send to young men coming up in the church who will grow up probably with a healthy disrespect for women and their holistic contributions because of the roles that he has seen them in growing up, not just in the society. And that's what's important here, not just in society, but our religious institutions have been on the front lines in creating a sacred nature out of sexism itself. And that is the ultimate juggernaut, because once you start connecting subordinate behavior to God and divine activity and morality, then you're saying that we are not doing this because it is a patriarchal invention of our minds. We are doing this because God wants you to live this way. And so when you are someone who privileges from that situation, and you understand yourself to be a privileged member of that group in that particular form of oppression, you are then charged by God to release whatever resources you have at your disposal to maintain that relationship. And that's why slavery was so hard to crack. That's why segregation was so hard to crack. Why racism and sexism are still hard to crack, because of the hierarchical privilege that is given vent to and given ultimate validation by God.
So let's go to a bigger picture here with this, Dr. Singleton, because I think because we don't really think of history on a global scale, we really don't understand that there have been inflection points in our global history where people have gone to war. Empires have risen and empires have fallen. So let's put this on an American scale. And I just saw this on TikTok, but another thing I've been thinking about for years. And I had a conversation with someone about what's going on in America. And this was years ago, not just 2022. I'm not saying. In the global arc of history, America is a teenager in puberty. And America has a decision to make. Am I going to grow up and be a good person, or am I going to grow up and be a bad person? And I'm simplifying it, but we're kind of at that inflection point, because in the arc of global history, the American government, as we know it, this democratic republic, is a mere teenager. As a matter of fact, a preteen. And we're going through a lot of hormonal changes in puberty. And we got to make some decisions on whether we're going to survive puberty. Everybody don't survive puberty, but I think our privilege, we don't really see the big picture of global history, that wars were fought over land, wars were fought over water, wars were fought, religious wars, led these land wars over land, wealth, whatever way you define it, whether it was gold, jewelry, or whatever, because you can simply look at the Catholic Church and see how much land they own, the jewels they have, the gold. It's $1 billion institution, multi-billion-dollar institution.
Religion is big business.
We not get there from being nice.
Yes, religion is big business.
Wars. Go ahead.
Religion is big business.
It's a big business, and you see. So let's drill it down even more within the Black community. And you see, y'all get mad at me. I want y'all to get mad at me. When I see billboards with the husband and wife and the first lady, and immediately I'm thinking big business, business, and you can even see it, how we present ourselves, how we wear clothes. You got to have a certain appearance, the marketing. I replied to someone just this morning about what would Jesus do. Was a marketing campaign. It was WWJD, y'all. Because they were saying, they went on to the next, but they went on to the next thing, because what would Jesus do was a marketing campaign, y'all. Absolutely. It really was. For you to buy stuff. Come on, let's all confess. How many bracelets y'all bought with WWJD on it and all? But did it change the core social justice Jesus that many of us don't know? No, it didn't. No. It didn't even, but it certainly pushed the church further along, because you bought a whole bunch of Bibles. I mean, the King James Bible has been the New International Version, the What Would Jesus Do version. You got to keep buying that Bible. So somebody making money. It's a big business.
It
And
is.
that's not, so full confession, Marilyn Hemingway is not a big fan of religion. If y'all have not picked up on that yet, do I consider myself a spiritual person? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. But I am not a big fan of religion. I'm not a big fan of churches, because if you look at the arc of global history, the church has been an institution that has started a great many wars. Now think of America as that preteen entering puberty, and what is a factor that for the last 50 years has been stirring up stuff and running a whole bunch of marketing campaigns. And the very first core one of it was about racism, a white lash towards the civil rights movement. But this movement, people have to understand, is a movement that came out of the peculiar institution of slavery. Because the church was used to enslave people. White plantation owners sat in the pews of the churches on the plantations, dictating to the enslaved people how they were going to worship and what God they were going to worship.
Right.
This thread it ties everything together through our history, and that's just a mere global history. If you look at Europe now, if you look at the northern Slavic countries and all, much more secular, not as religious, because they've gone through some wars that have ended some stuff and people have died. And I think because of our lack of knowledge, we do not realize how much the church, how much that guilt that the church puts on us is controlling us and controlling the decisions of us as individuals and controlling our decisions as government. And they don't want us to have that knowledge. That's why you have pushback from CRT. That's why probably even listening to us now, there's some people probably pissed off. And I hope y'all are pissed off. Go ahead.
Well, I one of the things that I try to establish in my second book, White Religion, Black Humanity, one of my principal arguments is that all of a nation's institutions will reflect its seminal value. All of them. And not only do they reflect the seminal value of the nation, but they reflect what begins to be the cornerstone of judging anything morally in the life of that nation. This does not just include secular institutions, so to speak, but they also include religious institutions. And so we have been thinking all of our lives that our religious institutions are the moral framework that provides a conscience for the nation. And it hadn't been. Our religious institutions have been given their intent to create a theology that buttresses the life of the nation morally. So whatever the intent is, as we have established, then becomes infused with our institutions. There's not one institution in America right now where you can't see blatant racial discrimination. Maybe HBCUs because they're historically Black colleges and universities. But when we look at our major institutions, you always see a struggle, and call the NAACP into existence, to challenge the hiring practices of America's institutions. Even as we have a conversation now in the AFC Championship is on, and we have 2 Black owners and 2 Black head coaches, but 70% of the players are Black. We can't find an institution in America that has a good record when it comes to being inclusive of people of color and women. This includes a church that has also been deeply segregated and divided, but more particularly, it's an institution that has had the power, because we have been socialized that it is, and that they're getting this from God, to create an intentional approach to hierarchical relationships that then becomes normalized because it is surrounded by a thin veneer of divine will and of Christianity. One of the things I always tell my students is that Karl Marx in this society is anathema. He's considered a condescending atheist who's probably busting hell wide open right now for conservative Christians. And Karl Marx, toward the end of his life, said, well, you can call me an atheist, you can condemn me to hell all you want to. I really don't buy into that anyway. He said, the only thing I've tried to do in my philosophy when it comes to religion is to make the world understand this fundamental reality, that wherever I go in the world and observe the worst forms, the most macabre forms of humanity's inhumanity to humanity, I see the word God lifted up more than any place else. Whether it was slavery during his time in America, whether it was the caste system using Hinduism to justify that brutal system in India, or whether it was what would become and what was becoming apartheid in South Africa. Those are three of the most deeply religious contexts in the world in his lifetime. And in all three of those contexts, we see a complete devotion to God and the understanding not only of God as someone who is a benevolent God, but also too as a God who has ordained the current relationships at that time, which means that your faith in God cannot be divorced from your having to accept, if you are part of an oppressed class, your oppression because God had ordained that oppression. We see it when it comes to race. And of course, we've seen it far too much when it comes to gender in this society as well. And so, so I understand you not identifying as being religious. I had a friend of mine who said he doesn't identify as being religious anymore. And my response to him was great. We need more people in religion that don't believe in religion. Now, what do I mean by that? We need more people in religion who are going to be critical of what we have inherited religiously and have a pretty good grip on what we have inherited and are not afraid to challenge long-standing interpretations of biblical revelation and challenge the conclusions theologically drawn by some of our most celebrated Christian theologians, whether it be the Cappadocian Fathers, whether it be the Reformation Fathers, whether it be the early church fathers, that have the courage to challenge that system, because in that lies the basis for transformation. As long as that criticism doesn't exist, the transformation does not happen, and the perpetuation, which is the goal of a bourgeois society, the perpetuation of oppressive relationships then will continue.
My only concern, and I hear what you're saying, and I actually agree with that. My concern is that I see young people who are rejecting the church, but I don't think they're rejecting it from a place of knowledge. I think and this is Marilyn's opinion. Y'all keep getting mad at me. I think they reject it from, they see something is wrong and don't quite understand why it's wrong. And they reject it, and it becomes a rejection for selfish reasons, because it's almost like the child that says, Mom and Dad told me not to leave the house after bedtime, but I'm going to do it anyway. But that's actually based on foolishness, because Mom and Dad are doing it maybe to protect you or understand the dangers are out there. They want better for you. But if you reject it from a place of knowledge, knowing that this isn't healthy, I understand why the church is doing this. I understand why this religion is doing this. And I reject that false concept. I want to go back to what the church originally stood for, that personal relationship, that spirituality, that social justice. Then you're rejecting the church because you're going towards something.
Right. They want to have an open discussion.
That's right. That's right.
And what happens is that there's no more closed institution in the world and the nation than religion, than churches, because churches maintain that what they're teaching came from God, and there's no need to have an open discussion about it. You know, God said it, but the Bible said it, I believe it, and that settles it. And so what you're trying to do is something that people in different generations, albeit in small numbers, have been trying to do for 1700 years. And that is trying to get church leadership to have an open discussion about how we arrived at our theological conclusions, our interpretations, and whether they are healthy for the Black community and healthy for human civilization, particularly women. You mentioned good. You said you didn't want to get real simple, but that's a real simple place to begin. The good, particularly philosophically. Our ancient Egyptian philosophers dealt with the good. What constitutes the good in society? Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, the Greek philosophers dealt with what is good, or what they referred to as the teleological dimension of human existence. And so the question then becomes, how then do we arrive at the good? Does that good come through rigorous conversation, or does that good come through revelation? Well, the church has maintained that God has already told us what the good is, and you're looking at it. But if I'm looking at it from the standpoint of someone who is experiencing an oppressive relationship, and even for some whites on the plantation and segregation now, who are looking at this as a privileged person because they're white and saying, this doesn't appear to be right to me.
Mm-hmm.
This doesn't appear to be good to me.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're then creating a community of people who are saying we need to have an open conversation. And that's why the church is losing a lot of young people, namely because they cannot have this conversation in the church, because we are taught from the time that we are in, diapers, that whatever we are teaching in this organization should not be questioned. And so that becomes very damaging, as you said, not only for Black people from a racial standpoint, because they can't even talk about how the Bible is used to justify Black oppression and fortify whites in their bigotry, who hear these sermons about Christian stewardship and maintaining status quo. And then Black women can't have these conversations because Black male pastors and some Black females in the church would rather maintain the status quo because it is considered to be a more peaceful way of engaging the situation and accepting your role and trying to do the best you can in that role. The problem is with that is that you are not fulfilling your humanity as a wise creation of God. You are accepting subordinate roles in the name of God. And that lends itself to a closed conversation and not an open conversation, particularly for Black women.
I would dare to say that, in my words, that the church lacks morals. There's no morality in the church right now.
We
This
had
comes
that
down to a
conversation
moral.
before. Absolutely.
This is a moral question. Where
But
are the morals in the church?
The question is whether the society has morals, whether we began this country, this experiment with democracy that's failing miserably, as Scholar Cornel West would say, whether the morality we thought we had was a morality to start with. It ends up being a negation of itself, namely because anytime you create a moral framework that sanctions oppressive relationships, is it really an authentic moral framework? And so the whole notion of a moral framework that's rooted in human oppression contradicts itself. And so to talk about an American morality is to talk about a phantasm. It is to talk about an illusion or a mirage, not necessarily in terms of the thickness of its existence and what will happen to you if you challenge it, but in its constitution itself. Does it have a moral and therefore an ethical right to exist if it is getting a significant segment of its population to passively resign themselves to an oppressive relationship? My answer to that question is absolutely not. And so the question then becomes, where then does the conversation begin so that we can negate an oppressive morality and begin to have a conversation about a more liberating morality? I think that it has to happen within the life of our religious structures, whether that's in the church, whether that's in the academy with theologians like me, because if we can get through the juggernaut of getting people to understand that our theological conclusions emerge out of a moral framework that should not tolerate human oppression, but should be rooted in human freedom, then we can begin to have a conversation that could affect societal relationships. But as long as we continue to think that God has sanctioned these hierarchical relationships, these oppressive relationships, or that I'd rather not go through the trouble of losing my life or being economically reprised or being physically abused or being lynched because I had the courage to speak out on it, let's just maintain the status quo. And so when you create a moral framework rooted in human oppression and ethically you try to silence the voice who says this has no right to exist, because it is an oppressive framework, particularly within the context of a democracy like America, and it puts down China and other countries that they call dictatorships, oligarchies, and engage in acute censorship. Well, what happens when you relegate an oppressive voice who's trying to transform American racial and gender discrimination to the periphery of contemporary American discourse? You are in essence censoring that voice without necessarily using the C word. So the framework itself becomes even more dangerous morally within the context of a democracy that maintains that everyone has the right of free speech, which is not altogether true. We have the right to say it, but America's always controlled the stages with which we have had the conversation.
That is so true. And we accuse, we're projecting on China what we have done, calling we've been imperialistic. We still are imperialistic nation. We're still a colonizing nation, and we are projecting these on China. And I'm not saying this to say that China is some victim in this and they're innocent. They're not. China has some problems too, but where did they learn that from?
Right.
Where did they learn it from? Where did Russia learn how to do certain things? Russia, where did Germany learn how to be Nazis? Well, they looked at Jim Crow in the South.
There's slavery.
And slavery, and they perfected that system, and then they projected it on mainly Jewish, but beyond that, homosexuals, the Romanians, the gypsies, and black people too.
Jehovah's Witnesses and black people. Hitler was coming for us, and Jehovah's Witnesses next, and the homosexuals after he finished with the Jews. Yes. So
and this goes back then to the moral question. What we are going through doesn't matter if you're black, white, Republican, Democrat. We are all upholding an immoral system. The system is immoral, and the church is part of that societal system of immorality right now. So the pressure cooker is going to explode at some point.
Right.
It is up to us as individuals. What is that explosion going to look like? And going back, now bring it back. I mean, this went to a broad question from black women in the black church. We're so broad with it, but it begs the question in, are black women in the black church upholding the system, the very immoral system that is suppressing us by not questioning?
Well, yeah, absolutely. We have talked about it in broad strokes, but all of the subjects we've talked about are rooted in sexism and black women's oppression. Namely in terms of the fear involved of speaking out against patriarchy, for being perceived as being this man woman who is speaking out when only men should do it. The persecution of women in terms of being sexual temptresses, who take men off of their goals in life, like Samson had with Delilah, and of course the promiscuity images with Jezebel in the Bible, that black women have had to deal with in a comparative moral designation, as I call it, that white women really have not had to deal with. One of the things they've had to deal with some sexism, but they've also been able to live a privileged existence being married to white men, and being married to white men who have not, been the scourge of a well and deeply entrenched plan to denigrate them, whether it be in the prison system, whether it be in the graveyard, whether it be to being an unproductive member in society, as that has been the case with black men. And so when we look at the image of black women and we see that image being presented and over and against white women who have that, that Queen Victoria image, the petiteness, the daintiness, the soft-spokenness, being well-dressed and being fully dressed, as they said, as they say, you can tell a woman's morality by the way she dresses. And, black women who were seen first in Africa by white planters and explorers, who were so-called scantily clad, namely because Africa has a tropical climate and it's not like Europe where it's in the 30s and 40s and they could do that, that all of that will become the basis, the sources by which Black women themselves would be denigrated and compared against white women as Jezebels on the one hand for Black women, and of course for white women, descendants of Mary herself in terms of her being a childbearer and the purity with which she conducted herself. In fact, the Bible story is that Mary didn't even have sex. She was overshadowed by God. And so she maintained her purity even in giving birth to the Son of God. And so in that sense, we are looking at the same structure. We are looking at an immoral system that unfairly targets Black women, make them the object, so-called, of white men's sexual desires. And we are looking more particularly at a religious institution that, number one, refuses to ordain them, but yet uses them selectively to carry out the mission of the church, even for a pastor to get married, because he know he can't get to church unless he is married. And so he marries someone that he may not want to marry, but he wants the church. And so we see, more importantly, we see an acute censorship on the part of women to make them think that speaking out on what they see is not really what they see. It's a phantasm, it's an illusion, it's a mirage, that their ultimate goal is to be a childbearer and not to transform the gender landscape in America and in the larger society, namely because God does not want you to occupy positions of leadership. I heard one of the most prominent ministers in America, who is unfortunately now deceased, but he had a big mega church. And he said in one of his sermons one day, women shouldn't hold leadership positions because she has a menstrual cycle. And that men should only hold leadership positions because men don't have to take time out for their menstrual cycle, and women do. And so, for instance, if a woman was a president, and you take the situation going on now with, say, Russia and Ukraine, a woman, if she had a period, if she was cramping bad or something, would have to take a time out and not be able to deal with international issues because she has a menstrual cycle. And this was not in 1607 or 1507. This was in 2007, if I'm not mistaken. And so as we have talked about this in broad strokes, there is a direct parallel to Black women in society and church relative to this same illegitimate moral framework, and of course, the legitimation of it by the church.
Well, there's been a lot of questions and comments, but a couple of things I want to say too. This also lends itself when what you just talked about. We contradict ourselves all the time. We're such hypocrites also. For example, the term when we use power behind the throne. It's like we kind of also recognize the strength and power of women, but we can't put it out there. We've got to cloak it in these cliches and things such as power behind the throne. And it's this sly recognition of the strength of women. Also, we're narrowing it down to Black women. Now we have under consideration a possible Black woman on the Supreme Court of the United States.
Yes.
It speaks to the political power of Black women, in particular in the Democratic Party, the base, that voting. And that's a whole nother show, y'all. We're not going to get into it.
I thought we might get to it today.
We're not going to get to it today.
No, but
y'all have some really good comments.
We're still talking about that in 2022, the first Black woman this and the first Black man that.
But this came about literally probably 2 weeks after Lonnie Guinier, the first Black woman who was considered for Attorney General, I believe she was.
Yes, Civil Rights Division.
That she
passed away.
Was just just massacred in her nomination just to be Attorney General. Now we're talking about the first Black woman possibly for the Supreme Court. And he said he's going to do it. President Biden said he's going to do it. So we're going to assume it's a Black woman. But y'all, the hell that Black woman is about to be put through.
Absolutely. And don't sleep on it.
That is not even an over exaggeration, y'all.
No.
And it's already started. And they don't even know a name yet. And it started the day when he said, I'm going to nominate a Black woman. They already came came for her. But it
And-
speaks to the power of the Black woman, but we still do not give true, open, honest credit to the Black woman, because it's still that power behind the throne. It's, you get attacked for being your authentic, true self. And I speak actually from personal experience too when I say that, y'all, it's very dangerous to be your true, authentic self. But I think we all should. That's what we should strive for. I think that's where true happiness is. For us to be a better society, that's what we all should strive for as individuals, to be our true, authentic selves, whatever that may be. But we've been raised in a society that dictates. That's a hard thing to do, folks. It's a hard thing to do. We got a lot to talk about, and we're gonna have to. We are over our hour. It has been so good. This is going by so fast. But two things I want to say: we have not even talked about submission. The term submission, but y'all,
obedience.
What? Say that again.
Obedience.
Yes, obedience and submission. Woo! That is going to take another hour. And I know we've had broad strokes this hour because we're limited on time, y'all. But I do want to say, go read the book, and I'm going to post it up because Dr. Singleton has a new book coming out, and I want to put that up because we're going to keep him coming back, y'all, because we have these conversations. And it's not just Dr. Singleton. If you follow A Gathering Place, we've talked about African-American intellectual traditions. With Dr. Derek Allridge, I've had my African-American history, y'all, and I try to tie all of these things together in broad strokes. They're all connected, but we have such scholars that concentrate on their fields that I try to bring them in to talk. But let's talk about your book briefly and see if we can answer a couple of these questions. But here's the book. Forever in Thy Path, The God of Black Liberation, by Dr. Harry H. Singleton III. So tell us briefly about this book and when you expect this to be available for us. Because I want to tell everybody, y'all go get his books so y'all can get specific information so we can have these, y'all, when we have these discussions, we all know what we're talking about. Tell us about this book, Forever in Thy Path, The God of Black Liberation.
Yeah, of course, the Forever in Thy Path comes from the Negro National Anthem, written by James Weldon Johnson. Keep us forever in thy path, we pray. And of course, I wanted to select something from the indigenous Black experience for the title, particularly since I'm dealing with the God and Black experience. And I use path as a metaphor in this book to denote the journey of African Americans from the hulls of slave ships to our current state. And so I devote a chapter, each of the chapters to some type of path. For instance, chapter 1 is the path of freedom. Chapter 2 is the path of conversion. And so all of the chapters have the word path in them because I wanted to make sure that I was elucidating path as a symbolic way of saying our journey has been an arduous, but it's been a highly rewarding journey, but yet we still have ways to go in that journey on that path from slave to free. And so it comes out. It was supposed to be out this week, but COVID is even affecting publication and printing at publishing companies with people out with COVID. The new release date is February 22nd. And so it will be available at Orbis Books, who's publishing it, Mayor Knoll, New York. You can also go to your local bookstore and order it if they don't have it on the shelves. I've always preferred that way because you can bypass the shipping and the handling. So I will be sending out posts on social media for pre-orders and in the coming weeks, and I will also be putting that cover up as well. My previous 3 works, Divine Revelation, Human Liberation is one, White Religion, Black Humanity is another one, and Black Theology and Ideology, my first book. You can go to my webpage, harrysingleton.com. You can click on the cover of the book when it comes up after you get into the webpage, and it will take you to ordering information for you to order the book directly from the webpage. And so I'm looking forward to it. It's my fourth labor of love, forever in thy path. And I hope that my readership will find it just as stimulating as I found it constructing it and writing it.
Well, I'm looking forward to it, and I really need to go buy your book. So this one will be available on your website also?
Eventually. It is not yet, but it eventually will be.
Okay. All right, y'all. So the simplest thing, HarrySingleton.com. You can also follow him on social media, and he'll be posting about it. And when he posts, make sure we get it, because we'll post it through the Gotta Get You Chamber Facebook and Twitter and Instagram accounts. We got a bunch of accounts now.
Right.
Thank you,
Yeah,
my
I
social
see.
media team and website team. We making things happen.
All right. You know you're going to get it.
So when you get it out to me, I will make sure we share it on all of our social media. We've had a lot of good comments today.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I think in the broad strokes, we probably answered some of them. One of them, Kent Williams, do you know of any religion, particularly Christian denominations, who offer the women of their church equal footing to men? Is there a model out there to emulate? Just a quick answer. Is there anything out there?
Though I don't know of any hierarchical models. The United Methodist Church has made a pledge for creating an ordination of women and making it more accessible for them. They would be probably the first one that would come to mind, particularly in the Baptist tradition. You're hitting or missing, because there is no Baptist church, but Baptist church is per se. And some of them are still dyed in the wool. I go to my grave not ordaining a woman. My father, actually, who was a pastor and social activist, ended up having to ordain a woman who was my kindergarten teacher, actually, in Conway. And he had to ordain her at the church, Cherry Hill Baptist Church, where he pastored, because the association refused to ordain her because she was a woman. And so this reality of exclusionary practice is still real. And it's made even more real, unfortunately, by people who think that they are engaging in good conduct, because in their upbringing, God has told them that this is a non-negotiable demand of the life of faith. It's rather unfortunate, but it becomes part of the larger narrative going forward. So
in many ways, the road to hell is paved with good intentions and good traditions.
Absolutely. Yeah. But it's still hell.
It's still hell, isn't it?
It's still hell.
Right on into that.
Heaven for a few and hell for the overwhelming majority is still hell for us all. And that's the message that we have not yet imbibed.
Yeah. Diane Bradley asks, how has the Black church become a business? We answered that earlier in the show. We did get into that, Diane, about the Black business, because it has always been a business. Somebody has made money from it. I'm trying to get back to Orton Bellamy. What is the future of the Black church? Well, my opinion, we don't know, but I do want to say this. I think when the doors reopen after this pandemic, Dr. Singleton, that there are going to be a lot of people surprised about who does not return to the church. And I'm not talking about the unfortunate family members and neighbors that we lost through death. I think the pandemic has really driven people to ask questions about, what has the church actually done for me? What am I getting out of being in church every Sunday in those four walls? Beyond that, what am I really getting out of this relationship with the church? And I say that deliberately, with the church. There are a lot of people question, and it's not obvious yet because we're not together again in the consistent way that we were before the church. And on a personal level, I was actually already attending church online. There were churches actually online before the pandemic. Everybody thinks everybody hopped on after the pandemic. No, there were churches online prior to the pandemic. And that's where I was personally attending. And I see, and there were people telling me, oh, you need to go to church. You need to go to church. And I'm like, I'm okay. I'm good. I didn't feel I had a need to explain myself to everyone. I just had to say, hey, I'm good. Now it's ironic that most people are attending church online because, for safety, health reasons, etc. But I think when we gather together again in person on a consistent basis, that there are going to be a lot of shocked not members, not congregation. There are going to be a lot of shocked ministers.
Mm-hmm.
The hierarchy is going to be shocked about who does not return to the church. And I don't know, that really doesn't answer the question. That's just my opinion. But any thoughts of yours on that one, Dr. Singleton?
Well, I think that the future of the Black church is in tremendous peril if it does not begin to raise societal critical questions from the pulpit, which is the gist of what we've been talking about today. It can no longer remain committed exclusively to personal wish fulfillment and a church with walls. It has to become a church without walls, but not just a church. I mean, most of our religious institutions find greater efficacy in insular approaches to religion than they do in addressing societal critical questions, because there's a price to pay. I mean, your church becomes scrutinized, your theology becomes scrutinized. All of a sudden you're teaching a foreign theology, but we must also keep in mind too, that was what was said about Jesus as well. As I said on the last show, when everyone else was in the temple worshiping, Jesus was out healing people on the Sabbath. And so the message inherent in that is that being religious is not about being in a building at the same time, at the same place every week. It is ultimately about one's commitment to transform oppressive human relationships. And that has to be a part of the narrative going forward. If it is not, the church will find itself in tremendous peril and it will lose members.
I do believe. And actually, I think that's a good time to leave it right on that note, because I want to leave y'all thinking. I want to leave y'all thinking so that we are in a transformative time in global history. We are in a transformative time with our American government. Therefore, we are in a transformative time with the church, because the church has informed so much of how we live in this society. And I'm just going to leave it right there, Dr. Singleton, that I hope people start really thinking about this and thinking of the morality of the moment. And America has our role in global history. Where do we go from here?
Exactly.
Where do we go from here? And that includes Black women in the Black church, because we may want to pretend we're behind the power behind the throne, but we are actually the drivers in the car seat.
Absolutely.
And that takes accountability and responsibility. And we're going to have to start asking ourselves some questions. So we best get, one thing that the pandemic has given us, and I don't think people really appreciate it, it has given us quiet and time. And I think we need to take advantage of that. It's when you are home by yourself, read more, gain greater knowledge, build some relationships with yourself, with your God, Jesus, however you define that. But we need to start asking some real questions.
Yes.
Some real questions. And hopefully shows like this, A Gathering Place, will help you start asking some of those questions and giving you a little bit of knowledge. But what I do know is go read some books. So go to harrysingleton.com, shameless plug, and go buy some books.
It wasn't me, it was you. Let the record show.
Yeah, it's me. That's my job. That's my job.
It wasn't me, y'all.
Dr. Singleton, I'm going to let you go because this went over. It was a wonderful conversation. Yes. You enjoyed it as usual. You know, when the book is out, we're going to bring you back. We're going to continue this conversation. And I think we're going to have to be ready for a separate conversation about submission. And what was the other word? Obedience. Submission and obedience. Because, whoo, Lord, that's going to be hot. Yes. I like them hot. Dr. Singleton, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you, Marilyn, always.
And I will be in touch, and we'll be talking. And Mr. Bellamy, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Orton. We appreciate it.
I know.
Craig Conwell, we appreciate it. Kit Williams, we appreciate it.
I know. You're welcome. I see Facebook user. I know. I suspect I know who that is. I think that's a relative of yours coming in from another page.
You think so?
I think so.
Probably is. That you know very well. So
yeah. That's right. Yeah. Knowledge is power. Look, we're gonna go. Thank you, Dr. Singleton, for joining us today. Y'all go to harrysingleton.com, buy his book, start reading them, because that will help us continue this conversation. Dr. Singleton, good to see you as always. Enjoy the rest of your day. and we'll see you later.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, dear. Can't
All
wait
right.
to be back. Bye-bye.
Yes, definitely. Good night.
Yeah.
Everyone, thank you for joining us on the Gathering Place. We went a little bit long today, and as one of our viewers, Craig Conwell, said, it took him a little bit for a short time from the NFL AFC Championship game. Of course, y'all know I don't watch the NFL anymore. That's a whole nother conversation. No, it's not. I'm a Colin Kaepernick supporter, and I have been boycotting it for a number of years now. But thank you for joining us today. Always come back on Wednesdays and Sundays at 4:00. And thank you for Dr. Singleton for joining us today as we talked about Black women in the Black church. And yes, it got to a broad discussion, but that's what we're all about. Just giving some knowledge and perspectives out there to help us all grow. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Get ready for work tomorrow. Get some rest. And we'll see you Wednesday at 4:00. Have a good evening. Good night.